Today we're going to be talking about how our current education system in Nebraska allows the schools, the districts, the legislators to take the customers for granted. And we're going to start with hearing from Ted Coldery. Now, he is one of the designers of the country's first charter legislation. This is way back 1990 that I'm going to be reading this quote from. And it's from a manuscript called "The States Will Have to Withdraw." And I think if you listen carefully, you'll hear how the description that Coldery paints here pretty aptly describes what we are seeing in Nebraska today. 1990 is a long time ago. I believe I was a freshman in high school then, and I'm nearly 44 now. So these are not new ideas that we're going to be looking at. They are, however, ideas that have been pretty effectively stifled in our state. We are also going to listen to Ted Coldery, something that he said looking back to this time in the early 90s. And then we're also going to look at some of the things that happen when schools, school districts, legislators take customers for granted. So let's get started. The following excerpt is from Coldery's manuscript, "The States Will Have to Withdraw." The state does not deal with schools, it deals with districts. Legally, schools do not exist, districts exist. The district is defined by its boundaries. These create an area in which there is one and only one organization offering public education, to whose schools the kids who live in that area are assigned. Public education is organized as a pattern of territorial exclusive franchises. Keep that in mind. That exclusive franchise is the heart of the problem. It means the state agrees the district will have the final decision about improvement. Governors and legislators like to talk as if they control improvement. We hear this in the legislature all the time, don't we? They don't. They can propose and promise, plead and threaten. They can give money, they can issue orders, and often the districts do respond. But whether they do or not, in the end, is up to them. If the district does not give the kids a good education, the state does not send in another organization that will. It accepts the pace of improvement at which the district is able or willing to move. The state also agrees to accept whatever reasons the district has for its decision to change or not to change, even if those reasons have to do mainly with the private and personal interests of the adults involved, as they sometimes do. A side note, do we have any organizations in Nebraska that looked after the adults exclusively and their interests in education? Oh boy, do we ever. Back to the manuscript. And the state agrees to accept those decisions and the reasons for them, whether or not the students learn. Look at last year's ACT scores. Within very broad limits, the state assures the districts their material success, their existence, their students, their revenues, their security, everything except their annual increases, and they do this independent of the level of student success. Nobody should wonder why in public education the cards are stacked against innovation. An organization with that kind of exclusive franchise feels no need to change. The risks are real. There is nothing countervailing, nothing that requires kids' interest to be put first. Nothing very bad will happen if the decision is to say no. As things stand, a no is the end of the matter. The principal who wants to change has nowhere else to go. The teacher has nowhere else to go. Parents and students have nowhere else to go. There is almost nothing anyone can change without getting someone else's permission. Yet almost everyone has the power to check everyone else. And practically nothing depends on making the improvements for which the public is pressing. Clear objectives, measurement of performance, new technology, or better learning methods. Unless something quite unusual happens, the students and the revenues will be there anyway. Good educators tell their colleagues, "We have to change." But that is not true in any real sense. They do not have to. The kids get what altruism, courage, and the random appearance of exceptional individuals provide in the way of improvement, which is often a lot. But the system puts them second. The system puts adults first. As Albert Shanker told the Itasca Seminar in Minnesota in 1988, this is a system that can take its customers for granted. So, this was written in 1990, and in 1991, Minnesota legislators chose to do something about their system which took its customers for granted. And these legislators did something bold. They passed charter school legislation, providing choice and accountability within this public school system. In the years since, nearly every other state in the country has made the same realization and made reforms that would put kids first and adults second. And yet here in Nebraska, we still have a system that can take its customers for granted. Now, there is often a mischaracterization of what charter schools are all about. And so I thought it would be helpful for you to hear in the words of Ted Koldery, the one that we were just reading from, his vision for why this was a solution to a system that could take its customers for granted. This is from a 2018 speech, so this is, he's able at this point to look back at many years of charter schools in many states and see what has happened and if it worked. And what his goal is. You'll often hear in Nebraska things like charter schools are the privatization. Actually, as you'll hear from Ted Koldery, charter schools were a way to avoid sending children from public schools to private schools. This is charter school legislation was designed as a way to keep children in public schools. Let's take a listen here.
Chartering is a state strategy for the improvement of the whole public education system. The paper that Gene kindly referred to that I wrote in the summer of 1990, and which you can read if you care to on the Education Evolving website, it is there, isn't it, Lars? Still the one I titled, "The State Will Have to Withdraw the Exclusive." The point was, this is the state's problem. The state has a problem, and you could tell that in those days. Governors here and legislators, people all around the country were feeling that they were not getting from the districts the kind of change and improvement they needed. And they were wondering what to do about that. They were told, of course, that they could go to vouchers. But if they didn't want to go to vouchers, and most of them didn't, vouchers meaning private schools, then they had to accept the system as it stood, take the district sector in its current form, and do the best they could with money and exhortation and whatever. And all you had to do was look at them and say, no, you don't. This is your system. It exists in your law. You make this law. If the districts aren't giving you what you believe the state wants and needs, it is entirely within your power to get somebody else who will. And my experience in this is that they would look at you for about 20 seconds, and then this big smile would come over their face when they got it. And once they got it, they never lost it. And that I think is, as much as anything, what accounts for the fact that the charter idea spread around the country through the 90s in almost all the major states in that decade, always against the opposition of all the interests that the realists and the education, political reporters thought would kill any kind of initiative. But in addition to the surprise represented by the enactment of these laws all across the country was the surprise about the schools created. You have to remember, no charter law created any school. These were enabling laws, and people had to come out. What the charter laws did was to activate a suppressed desire in the American public for something different. And so all over the country, good citizens and others, parents and activists and others came up in the early years when there was no way to do it except with sweat equity to create these kinds of schools. So the charter sector, as I like to say today, represents the R&D sector of American public education from the state standpoint. Because all the laws were open as to the kind of school that could be created. How large it would be, how it would teach, how it would organize, everything about it was open. And a fair amount of innovation did occur. There are a lot of conventional schools, people trying to do conventional school better, which is fine. There were also non-traditional and non-conventional schools. I think where we are at the moment is that after 25 or 30 years, the charter sector has proved it and itself. And it's what I say now as I go around is to legislators again, is that the success of public education in general and the success of the district sector in particular requires a strong and successful charter sector.
So I think it's interesting, if you have only heard about charter schools from the monopoly in Nebraska, you would have no idea what they were first created to do. They were first created to strengthen public schools. And if you look at the data, that is exactly what they have done. They have lifted the standards everywhere where they are, which is in most places now in the country. What happens when we have a more open law, when people can create a new school within the public school system that meets certain needs that aren't being met, or that try out some new and innovative learning methods, or perhaps try to tackle a new topic that is of interest to students now that hasn't been available in the past. We can look around the country and see the amazing, really innovative and interesting schools that have come out of the charter school sector. Now in Nebraska, instead of trying out these ideas, instead of opening things up, what we have seen is an attempt to close things down even further. So you've probably seen the ads from Nebraska Loves Public Schools, which is an organization funded by the Sherwood Foundation, and its objective is to get people to think, we don't need to open things up. We don't need innovation. What we have is just fine. Its very name, Nebraska Loves Public Schools, tells people what to think about the current system, and what happens is we don't get to take advantage of the innovations, the research and development going on in other places, and that puts our students at risk. It makes it so that our kids in Nebraska don't have the same kinds of opportunities that kids have in the rest of the country. Through these videos, we're going to look at lots of the interesting things going on in the rest of the country where they've been able to open things up. And we can also look at the consequences of doubling down on the monopoly and saying, this is all we want, this is good enough for us. You know, you can look at the motives. Why would we not want to help kids have more opportunities? Well, opening things up makes it so that the power is not as concentrated, and the people in power don't want that, do they? We're going to take a look at one specific way that that charter schools have helped kids, and that is with teacher absenteeism. And I would like to argue that teacher absenteeism is a sign that teachers are not thriving either. So this clip is from a researcher who looked at teacher absenteeism in charter schools versus traditional public schools. This will be just a short clip. Here we go.
Rather than me summarize it, why don't you tell us the headline numbers as you see them?
Yeah, sure thing. So I think the biggest finding is just that teachers in traditional public schools are almost 3 times as likely to be chronically absent as teachers in charter schools. And then beyond that, we also see that in states where collective bargaining is required for traditional school districts, but not for charter schools, we see particularly large gaps between the two sectors. And then finally, we were able to show that unionized charter schools were about twice as likely as non-unionized charter schools to have, the teacher chronic absenteeism rates were twice as high there.
I see.
So,
and then, of course, the charter sector is decentralized. There are some large CMOs, charter management organizations, but also a lot of mom-and-pop individual charter schools. How did you get the data?
Yes, so all of the data comes through the Office for Civil Rights at the Department of Education. So in some cases, it's reported at the network level. Generally, it's reported at the school level. We didn't break out mom and pops versus networks. We did look at several major networks like KIP. Those were pretty interesting numbers, I think.
That was David Griffith from the Fordham Institute. These kinds of studies that are coming out, because now we have lots of schools, lots of data, lots of states doing this, it's becoming easier and easier to see that by opening up the public school system and breaking up those territorial exclusive franchises where schools are guaranteed money, students, resources without having to produce any results. By breaking that up and making it so that there is more openness and opportunity and innovation and research development within the public school system, what we have are more successful students, happier teachers who are not chronically absent, a focus on kids. So in our next video, we're going to look at some of those options, some of the really interesting things that have come to pass in states that have opened up their public school system. And I really hope that we have some courageous legislators in the legislature right now who can bring some of this forth. They're up against serious money. They're up against unions who have used pretty brutal tactics against people running for office who support school choice and charter schools. But we need their courage. The kids of Nebraska need these opportunities if they're going to be able to compete with students from around the country who have had these kinds of opportunities for a quarter of a century. So for more, please subscribe to our YouTube channel. You can also find us on Facebook and Twitter, and we've got a podcast which is on iTunes now. And thanks so much for tuning in.